This morning's going to look a little bit different than usual. Rather than hearing me preach about a particular passage, we're going to wrap up our time in Leviticus by hearing from someone from each of the small groups that have been studying Leviticus. To prepare, I gave the groups a little bit of direction, and I asked them one of two things. The first thing I asked was, I wanted them to share about the experience of seeking God together by reading and discussing Leviticus as a group. Because as many of us have found, Leviticus is a challenging read. And I thought it would be beneficial for us all as a church to hear about how reading it as a group affected people's ability to make sense of it, to wrestle with it, to have permission to ask questions about it, and to work their way through it. I then also asked the groups to share how seeking God in Leviticus affected their head, their heart, and their hands, or the head, heart, and hands of particular members of the group. And so actually, if you pull out your sermon notes for me from your worship folder, these are the questions that each group or group members tried to answer and that somebody from that group will speak on behalf of. So if you look on the back side, these are the questions. In what ways has studying the book of Leviticus challenged, changed, or confirmed what you think about God? In what ways has studying the book of Leviticus challenged, changed, or confirmed the desires or motivations of your heart? In what ways has studying the book of Leviticus challenged, changed, or confirmed the works of your hands, the way that you live? So these are the questions that the groups have been considering and trying to answer. And at the end of this time this morning, I'll create just some space for us all to reflect on these questions, to reflect on what the Spirit has been teaching us. And I thought, to kind of get us started, I'd offer an initial reflection on behalf of just my own experience as part of a group, as part of this church, and then we'll hear from three others. A few weeks ago, I was telling Derek that Leviticus was making a lot more sense to me than it had the very first time he and I read it together, which was several years ago. I had read through it probably 5 or 6 times a couple years ago. And then in the last year, I read it 2 or 3 times. And then we read through it 3 times in our small groups. And then I read through it 2 additional times over the last 6 weeks as I've been preaching from it. And I told Derek that it's really only been in those last several reads that this book has really kind of come alive for me in a way it hadn't before. And his response was profoundly simple. He just said, "You're teaching it. What do you expect?" As all educators know, right? Something happens to us when we turn content that we've learned into something that we're trying to make accessible for someone else. Information becomes more than information when we've received it and when we've organized it and when we've understood it or internalized it and then communicate it to others. And this has been one of the main goals of what our small groups are doing together. You read for 5 days, answering questions, coming up with new questions, taking notes, and then on the 6th day, you look back over your notes and you organize them into themes or ideas. You make guesses about what might be happening, and then you meet with your group to share some of these conclusions, to challenge your group with the questions that you've been struggling with, and to get input from others. And so on a weekly basis, you come to a small group and you're teaching your small group about what you've been reading and how you've been attempting to make sense of it. And the way that this played out for me is one week during small group, I brought our group a theory that I had been working on about the dietary restrictions and the various clean and unclean categories in chapters 11 through 15. And I was sharing it, and I had just begun to share it, and a couple people in our group gave me this, I don't think so. And so then I kind of gave some more details, and I started to try to build on that, essentially giving more evidence for my theory, trying to build a case on the scriptures that we had just read. And the really cool thing was, since they had just read the same scriptures that week, they could actually evaluate the merit of the theory that I was throwing out there, and we refined it and tweaked it a bit. But our group along the way challenged the way that I think about God and the way that I think about Leviticus. But there were also conversations along the way that pushed me to challenge my desires and to live in certain ways. David Moore and Alex Emerson, they had shared about how Leviticus was causing them to rethink worship. And they'd begun to reflect on whether they were giving acceptable worship to God. And they were wrestling with their desire to keep worshiping in familiar ways. And then they were identifying tangible ways that they might give acceptable worship to God. And all of the way, as they're kind of processing this out, it's pushing me. And my conversations with the two of them actually was sort of the initial seed for the sermon that I preached on Nadab and Abihu. And then I got to have a really cool conversation with the Friday night small group, and we talked about Leviticus 19. And we were talking about and wrestling through the social implications of our faith. And as a result of that conversation, I realized how important it is for me in my role among us to create space for us as a church to be talking about how our faith should influence our lives and our service and our politics, and on and on. And so these are some of the experiences that I've had. And we're going to hear next from Joel, who's going to talk on behalf of the Friday night group. So, Joel, come on up, man.
All right, hello, everyone. Oh, applause already. How's the sound? Sounds okay? Okay, well, I'm Joel, and I attend the Friday night group at Robert and Joan Cruz's house. And I'm just going to start out by saying that I don't think there was really one person in our group that was very excited to study Leviticus. Obviously, we've seen Leviticus is a little bit of a challenging book. It's a book, for me, it's always kind of hard to read a book that doesn't have a whole lot of narrative in it. Leviticus is mostly, there's a few exceptions with narratives, but it's mostly instructions. It's instructions on how to give offerings. It's instructions on how to do sacrifices. It's dietary restrictions, hygienic restrictions, stuff like that. The few examples of the actual narratives are a little bit discomforting in chapter. At first it seems like not a very friendly book. Chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu are struck dead because they did something wrong. They had the wrong kind of fire in the sacrifice. Chapter 24, a blasphemer is stoned. That was another good one. But one thing we did manage to get a lot of good things from Leviticus, and we also a lot of our groups, we didn't focus on Leviticus in every single group, but what we did do is the way our group is set up is we all start and we have dinner and we sit around the table in the living room, and after our meal is done, we go to this big wraparound couch that is super duper comfortable, and we start to study the Bible. So on the days, on a few of these weeks, we didn't even make it to the couch. We just sat around the table and fellowshipped for pretty much the whole 2.5 hours, and it was really good to kind of get to know the members of the group on a little bit more of a personal level. Just having intimate around the table setting for nearly 2 hours. Anyway, we did manage to get certain things out of Leviticus. One thing that we all came to the conclusion that after all the offerings and the instructions and don't do this and don't do that, and people get killed for disobeying instructions, at the end there's a definite reward for obedience. So it's not all about following rules. It's also, there's a definite reward to be gained from following God. And that really illustrates God's love for us. and for the Hebrews especially that are in Leviticus. If he says, if you don't follow me, I'm going to make your life miserable. If you keep not following me, I'm going to amplify it sevenfold. If you keep not following me, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, but I'll never completely forsake you because I made a covenant with you and I love you. If you do follow God, there's all, he basically, what I got out of it was that you won't have to worry about anything. All your needs will be met. You'll get good crop yields. You'll get peace and harmony and whatnot. So we did manage to get that despite all that harshness and all these rules, that God loved the Hebrews and he made a covenant with them. Excuse me, I got to admit, I don't think that I really adequately prepared. I didn't use all the questions you were going over and the prompts and stuff like that. So I do apologize if this sounds a little bit informal and off the cuff. But let's see, what else did we... so there's a loving, God is loving, but he's also very stern. One thing it really illustrated was that it's a lot easier to be, Christians didn't exist back then because Jesus hadn't come yet, but it's a lot easier to be a Christian in the year of our Lord than it was to be a Hebrew before Christ. So I think we can all consider how lucky we are to live today instead of 1,500 years before Christ. An interesting fact that one thing I learned actually about being in the group is that Robert is very good at moderating the group. I really appreciated, where's Robert? There's Robert. I really appreciated that on some of the weeks, even when we didn't really want to be on task, he found ways to kind of bring our conversation back to Leviticus. And one of the things that I think it was him that found it out, but some of these dietary and hygienic restrictions that the Hebrews were told to observe benefited them during the Black Death in the 1300s because, excuse me, my mouth's getting dry. Because, specifically, discharges causing uncleanliness, you got to isolate the person for 7 days or a certain amount of time, cleansing from infectious skin diseases, the prohibition of eating certain foods. So the Jews were taught to be very hygienically conscious, and that actually benefited them during the Black Death. I believe that they had a lower mortality rate than people that weren't observing Jews. Let's see. So one thing I got out of, I think the thing that I personally gleaned most from studying Leviticus with the group was, it was interesting to see that we were all kind of initially on the same page, that we were not enthusiastic about studying this book. But in the midst of our, I don't know what we would call it, griping about, Leviticus, we managed to have some really good fellowship and some really good conversations. And in the end, we did manage to get some actual meat and potatoes from Leviticus itself. So sorry if it was a little informal. Thanks for listening.
Hello. I'm going to start by just sharing the thoughts that a few of the individuals in our Thursday night group shared. We meet over at Jay and Sajan's house. Allie Kirby shared that one thing she realized is that religions pick and choose what rules to follow from Leviticus. Her head tells her to follow all the rules and laws of the book. Her heart told her to follow what is more up to date, but in a form that is close to the laws of Leviticus, like finding the heart and the spirit behind the laws. And her hands try to live the laws and teach her boys the laws so they can understand the laws of God. Penny shared that the study has caused her to reflect on her worship and to be more intentional and aware about how she worships. I think that was the same for many of us. Claudia shared that, sorry, I hope you guys don't mind, I'm totally calling you out. Who shared what? Claudia shared that in Leviticus it was unacceptable to be unclean physically and still enter the tabernacle. Today, outward uncleanness still creates a barrier, but behind the uncleanness is a person made in God's image. Leviticus 19:18 states, "Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Uncleanness can interfere with the Great Commission, reaching others. Claudia consciously and missionally interacts with the community breakfast participants who are her neighbors, part of God's all-inclusive family. And Russ isn't able to be a part of our small group, but he shared that from reading the daily worship guide and being participating in the sermons, he's growing spiritually and demonstrating deeper insights into his own blind spots that are needed to be addressed in order to mature as a Christian. Amen to that, Russ, for all of us. As a group, we talked a fair amount about the animal sacrifices and requirements, clearly. And we learned that the Israelites had many of their regulations in order to reorient the way that they worship God. They weren't to worship God in the same way that false gods are worshipped. Other cultures used blood for divination. And because of this, God had very specific regulations about pouring out the blood, never consuming the blood, and that all of this blood pouring out takes place in a specific spot. They weren't to go sacrificing animals willy-nilly, wherever and whenever they wanted to. They were set apart to be a people different than the surrounding nations. And one of the questions I had one week was from chapters 21 to 22, where it talks about God being sanctified by Israel. What? Because I thought that we were sanctified by God, and I was real confused by that. So we talked about that as a group, and it turns out that sanctify means to be set apart. So as God was setting the Israelites apart from the nations around them, so they were setting him apart in their worship, and that served as a testimony to all the nations around them. So that was kind of an aha moment for us. Finally, I think as a group, what's been kind of fun is learning how to learn together and not so much relying on our pastor to share all of the insights with us. I know that the first week that Derek Slacker missed our group, it was kind of a quiet week for us. Kind of like, okay, any other thoughts? And it was a little tragic. But several weeks later, the next time Derek wasn't able to come, there were at least 3 of us who had done some extra study to try and become prepared. And it was a whole different story. It was really fun to see what other people had found through, looking back further in the scriptures to previous weeks, or, looking in a commentary. Or turns out that all of us have quite a few resources available to us, and it's been fun to kind of grow as a group. So that's it. Brian.
I too am from the same small group, and wasn't sure what was going on here, but apologize for kind of reading this to you, but I stand in front of students for 10 months out of the year, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this for you guys instead of having to, So essentially what I wrote was a synopsis of kind of where we came from, and then through Leviticus, and then kind of what I learned. So here we go. We end the book of Exodus having learned about a God who has rescued a nation of people, the Israelites, from slavery and has drawn them out of Egypt and into a new land. God now has the uphill task of creating a new culture, new ways of thinking, worshiping, and living that will not only break Israel's old habits on worship and life, but instill new ones based on God's instructions. And these instructions are found in Leviticus. These new instructions are at times familiar to them, such as sacrificing animals, and other times different, such as not drinking blood, things they used to do in their past. God's purpose with these new rules is, number 1, to teach the Israelites how he wants them to live. Number 2, to communicate that he is their God to them and to other nations, and that they are his chosen people. And 3, and maybe most importantly, to distinguish himself as the God that is supreme and sovereign over all other gods. As we talked about and I reflected on the book of Leviticus, my thoughts had me examining my own journey with God and the similarities my story has with the Israelites. I too have been drawn out of a life of slavery, one to sin and death, and brought into a new life with my God. Now that I have been given new life, now what? How do I live, worship? Do I still participate in my old habits? Do I continue to worship the same gods that I used to? Or does God want to create a new culture in me, new ways of thinking, worshiping, and living? If so, am I resistant to these new instructions, or do I embrace them? Like the Israelites, God wants different for me, a life that continuously brings me back to him, like the many sacrifices necessary by the Israelites, a life of sacrifice, not of animals, but of selfish desires and greed. Thankfully, the God of mercy has not grown impatient with me as he did with Nahab and Abihu. Do I give generously of what I have to others, as the Israelites gave part of their sacrifices to the priests? Is my offering of time, money, attention, and worship acceptable in God's eyes? Would it be consumed by fire, or would it be left lacking and I found unfaithful? What changes do I need to make so that my offering is one that is faithful and sacrificial? Thanks.
I hope that you find these offerings from our community to be encouraging and edifying, challenging. We want to find ways to bring the voices of our church out as we are seeking God and seeking to serve God. What does it look like for us in this space when we gather for worship to come with an offering to contribute as we learn and grow together? And what I want to do for these next few moments, I said that I was going to give some space for all of us to reflect. The book of Leviticus is the starting point for talking about worship. If we're going to talk about worshiping God, Leviticus is where we sort of have to begin. We talk about discernment as a spiritual discipline, as a practice that Christians engage in, discerning between things. Leviticus is the place where we begin to learn that practice. The role of the law for God's people, the relationship between law and grace, the way in which law is grace. To understand what Paul is saying in the New Testament, we start with Leviticus. If we believe that God has called us to be holy, Leviticus is the place that we have to start for that. If we are to understand ourselves as a kingdom of priests, that we have all been called to be God's holy priests in the world, Leviticus is the starting place for understanding what that might mean. Redemption, covenant faithfulness, God's name, these are themes that pervade Scripture, but that some of their foundational ideas come from this book. And so what I want you to spend just a few moments doing, if you look at the sermon notes, as you think about your engagement with this book, consider your own personal reading and study. If you are in one of the small groups, your first reading, your second reading, your third reading. Consider the discussions that you had in your small group. Consider the daily worship guides as you read some of Leviticus and engaged the New Testament in light of it. Consider the sermons that you've heard. Consider the follow-up conversations that you've had. In light of those, consider your head, heart, and hands and the ways in which through this book God has met you and has either challenged or changed or confirmed what you thought previously, what you desired previously, or the work of your hands. And so we'll just take a few minutes and consider that, think about that, maybe jot down some notes there so that this might be something you could share with your group, with your household, or someone else this week. As we prepare to come to the table, let me leave you with this thought about Leviticus. The very first week I preached on Leviticus, I said that according to the Jewish way of naming books of the Bible, you would take the first word, and that would be what it would be called. And the name of Leviticus would be, "and he called." That Leviticus is a word from God. God is eager to speak to his people. And that the word behind all of the offerings and what the Israelites were to do was draw near. God was calling his people to draw near. The book of Leviticus, at its very heart, is the call from God to his people that they would draw near to him. This is as important a message for us in any day as it was for the Israelites in their day. That God is calling to us, that we might draw near to him, that we might meet with him, that we might be eager to hear his words and to respond, to live in obedience to him, so that our lives, as we live in this world would be marked by his holiness. This is what the book of Leviticus is about. And this is exactly what Jesus was about and what he communicated. He was enabling and enacting by offering himself for us. That he, like God for Israel in the wilderness, was setting us free from slavery. He was going to deliver us from sin and death, was going to redeem us, and was going to bring us into his promises. And as we come to the table this morning, that's what we're reminded of, that our God has promised to act on our behalf. In fact, already has. And so today we can walk in light of that hope, looking forward to his promises and living by his Spirit in this day.